This is stuff we might want to talk about.
Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. One of the real privileges of hosting this podcast is I've got to interview some people that I've been reading for years and read while I was incarcerated. And today is going to be a real treat because I'm going to get to interview someone who wrote for the first libertarian publication I ever read, which was the Freeman, or at the time it was called Ideas on Liberty. Sheldon Richman, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, for 15 years, you were editor at the Freeman, which is published by the Foundation for Economic Education. You're, what is it, the editor-in-chief? What do you call it at the Libertarian Institute?
Executive editor.
Executive editor, and you've written an abundance of books, including School and State, How to Liberate America's Families. And you also wrote a recent blog post called The Logical Atheist, which I thought was very good. And you cited somebody that helped in my conversion to atheism, the late George H. Smith.
Yes.
So when did you...
A great libertarian philosopher.
Oh, he was on the atheism stuff. I haven't read an abundance of his other stuff, but on the atheism stuff, he was rock solid. So when did you become a libertarian, and what drew you to the philosophy?
Well, I would say roughly in 1967, 68. My political awakening was 1964. A lot of people my age, libertarians my age, are going to tell you the same thing. I had an older brother, passed away in the late 90s, but he was in college, so he's a couple of years ahead of me, and he was very interested in the Goldwater campaign. So this is, like I say, a typical story for my age. And through him, I was learning, who's this guy Goldwater? I don't think I paid any attention to politics. A little bit of the Nixon Kennedy race, but that was 1960. I was born in late '49. Give you an idea how old I was. Okay. So the very end of the year, okay, that was Harry Truman's first year in his own full term, right? He gets elected 48. I was born the day after Christmas of 49. And so 64, I was 14, and already had my bar mitzvah. So so I'm learning about Goldwater from my brother, because he's kind of giving me stuff or sending me stuff. And he was writing a column at his college newspaper in Pennsylvania. We were from Philadelphia, living in Philadelphia. And I read the Conscience of a Conservative. I had trouble finding the book, actually, in a bookstore. I was in a very Democratic neighborhood, very Jewish Democratic neighborhood in Northeast Philadelphia. I couldn't find the Conscience of a Conservative. I found it in a place called Joe's Bookshop, who was a member. He was a member of the John Birch Society, and it had one wall of books called Joe's Bookshop, and it was like a shoe repair place. Joe's Shoe Repair, which had one wall of books. But he had the Conscience of a Conservative. I wasn't interested in the Birch Society. I didn't even know what it was. So I bought the book, and I really liked it. He was talking about American liberty and individual freedom, free markets, limiting government, the Constitution as a limitation on government power. I didn't pay much attention to the foreign policy stuff. I was, real newbie. And so I thought, and I always liked stories about the American Revolution. As a kid, I saw like Johnny Tremaine. These names may not mean anything to anybody these days, but there were stories like Disney had some stuff about the Swamp Fox, who was about Francis Marion in South Carolina, who was a guerrilla fighter during the Revolution. And it wasn't so much the fighting that attracted me. I was never a fighting type of kid. But this idea of a struggle for individual freedom, that just made sense. The moment I heard about it, it made sense to me. And I started extending it to other things. I remember when I first heard about censorship, like even pornography, I thought, well, that doesn't sound right. I mean, I just kind of, it was built in. I was the only one in my family like this, though. My family turned out one libertarian. You're looking at them. So from there, once people like in 67, 68, and I guess I was in high school by then, I would say something to other kids. I was interested in Goldwater, or I just, read Conscience of a Conservative. They said, well, if you like that stuff, you got to read Henry Hazlitt, Economics in One Lesson. You got to read it. And then they said, right away to the Foundation for Economic Education. At the time, it was in Irvington on Hudson, New York. It moved a few years ago. Because and they have a monthly thing. It was a little magazine in those days. It was about this big, called the Freeman. And they said it won't cost you anything. And once your name is on the list, it'll be on the list until the day you die. They never drop anybody off the list. And you don't have to ever send them any money. I was a student. So I immediately did all that. And then, of course, somebody inevitably, don't remember what it is, said, have you ever heard of Ayn Rand? And I said, no, who's that? And they said, Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged. So I read that stuff, and I wasn't like a super fast reader. I didn't immediately devour this all in one weekend like some people did. It took me a little bit of time, but we're into 68 now, 69, and I read the nonfiction stuff. And just as a footnote, or we can delve into this, I didn't hear the name Ayn Rand or any of the books until after the split. So I was not a child of the divorce. And I thank my lucky stars that occurred, because I had nothing to do with it. I said, what's this about? To whom it may concern? What's she writing about? I don't know anything about this. So it was just, I was able to just purely think about the philosophy and the stories and the sense of life and all that. I didn't know anything about anything, the other stuff. I only learned that later, a little bit later, but it wasn't in my most formative years. But then you got to read somebody named Ludwig von Mises. And they gave me shorter things than Human Action, which is this thick, but other things, Plain Chaos. I can't remember all the names now. And then you start coming across names: Rothbard, Kerzner, Hayek. Who's this guy Hayek? One of the founders of the Institute for Humane Studies, Floyd F.A. Harper. So there's F.A. Hayek and F.A. Harper. I remember thinking, are they all F.A. something? F.A. and then an H name? It was funny how you remember these crazy little things. And so that's the path. It probably was similar to you. You hear one, and then it's like dominoes standing up rather than falling. One stands up, they all stand up. So
it's amazing, because your story mirrors mine. I read the book The Law by Frederick Bastiat.
Oh yeah,
and on the back of it, it had the address on Irvington on the Hudson, New York, for a place called the Foundation for Economic Education. And I had also at that point read Free to Choose by Milton Friedman. And so I fell in love with economics once I read that one book. So I said, well, let me write to this place and see if they'll send me any information on economics. And they sent me a 1-year subscription for free. It was called Ideas on Liberty at that time. It was the same basic magazine. And that's where I came
we
across
briefly changed it. It did get changed back.
Yeah. And I got the same thing. I came across, Mises, Hayek, and I laissez-faire books they had advertised in there. And I started ordering from them, and A Human Action and Rose Wilder Lane, and just an abundance of thinkers that I found very, very persuasive, and still do, even after I forced myself to read people that opposed them or were arguing against what I guess you'd call libertarian economics, for lack of a better term. So I read Keynes, I read Krugman, Marx, and Engels. And I still find the liberty philosophers overwhelmingly convincing. Now, what gave me the idea for this interview is on Twitter, you posted a picture of yourself with Thomas Saz, and I think it's pronounced Ralph Raico.
Raico.
Okay, and he was I only know of him. I've read an abundance of Saz, but Raico was a member of the Circle Bastiat, right? With
he was an early friend
Murray
of
Rothbard.
Murray Rothbard, Leonard Liggio, Robert Hessen, who just died. Raico died a few years ago. A few others, George Reisman.
Yeah.
It was an early New York group of people, friends, who were all interested in, first of all, the Taft campaign. Robert Taft in 1952 when he was challenging Eisenhower for the nomination. But they were they were reading classical liberalism and Bastiat. I apologize to Bastiat Spirit for neglecting. I'm glad you mentioned them. That was very important. The law, and then other stuff, economic fallacies, economic sophisms. Sophisms, not fallacies. Economic harmonies. That's one of the ones.
So somebody on Twitter the other day asked.
And Raico was a historian. Raico did his PhD under Hayek at Chicago.
Oh, that's excellent. I didn't know that. See, I learned something. That's why I love doing these interviews.
Yeah, and he's Committee on Social Thought. Don't forget, Freeman vetoed basically Hayek getting into the econ department when he came to the United States in 1950. So he went into this thing called this Committee on Social Thought. I don't think it was new for him. I think maybe it already existed. I'm not really sure. But several good libertarians studied under him. Ronald Hammaway, who was also an early associate of Rothbard in that circle, and Ralph Raico, who was a very dear friend of mine, talked to him a lot. He spent a year at the Institute for Humane Studies when I went to work there back in the late 80s, mid 80s. So a very good historian, very significant, thorough and conscientious historian. Hated the Soviet Union with a passion.
So Saz and Reiko, you described as mentors to you. So
yeah, that's very fair.
That is amazing to me. So starting with Saz, what was it like learning from these men on a personal basis? I mean, I've learned everything from from Saz, from his books, but I can't imagine being able to actually, when you ask him questions and pick his brain. It must have been just a phenomenal experience, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I wish I was around them more. I got to spend a whole year with Ralph Raico because he took a sabbatical. He was at the State University of New York at Buffalo most of his career, tenure there. But he spent a year when I joined IHS because I was for about 5 years worked at the Institute for Humane Studies, and so he came and did a sabbatical there, and with Saz, I never got to spend that much time with Saz. So I did visit him in his home, and I did an interview with him, which is the video is on YouTube. If you look me up on YouTube, you'll find my interview with him, which was 2005. He dies in 2012, so it might have been one of the last. I think he might have done something later. But one thing that impressed me about these two men, even though they're very different fields, right? Although Saz is very interested in history. Sass, I should say Sass. I always slip and say Sas. He says it's pronounced like Saskatchewan.
Okay.
So for anybody who's wondering, he always told me the A in Sass was like the A in apple. Apple. We don't say apple. Maybe they do in Britain, but we don't say apple. Anyway, Sass. It sounds funny. I used to live on a street called Sassy Road. I thought, this is karma. I'm living on Sassy Road, and I'm a fan of Thomas Sass. So what impressed me about these two people, to begin by talking about both of them, is their absolute integrity. I mean, these were very serious, very joyful people too. But when I say serious, I mean, they took their work very seriously. So to me, their integrity just shined from their whole beings. They were very serious. They were committed to liberty, both of them. But they were committed also to the most honest scholarship they could possibly engage in. I mean, that just has so impressed me. It's not that they told me that. They didn't have to, put it in a neon sign. First of all, you can read it, but I could also see it in just seeing them, talking to them on the phone or in person. So that's one good thing. But of course, I was also moved by the message. Both of them dedicated their professional lives to advancing the cause of liberty, one through purely historical analysis of war, the different wars of politicians, war-making politicians. That was kind of Raico's main interest. He knew a lot about World War I and World War I and the whole 20th century, basically, but mostly on the more the foreign policy side. And Sass, of course, as I guess, maybe people don't know, was a medical doctor. I mean, he was born in Hungary. Ralph was born in New York. He was born in Budapest, but in 1920, in 18, he comes to the United States, and he goes to Cincinnati and does his college work, gets his undergraduate degree, goes to medical school. And he told me that he went to medical school because he wanted to know how the body worked. He was just interested. He apparently never had really intention of practicing medicine. He wanted to know how the body worked. But then he went into psychiatry because he wanted to have the qualifications to debunk psychiatry. So that was his work. Now, he told me back when he was under 18 in Budapest, and he lived not far from a mental hospital where he knew people were locked up against their will. He knew even back then. I mean, he had the thought, that's not right. These people haven't committed crimes. They'd be in prison. these people are in there for just bothering other people. Or if they really did commit a crime, why aren't they being treated by the criminal justice system, not by this thing we euphemize by calling calling them hospitals, except they can't walk out. It's
Yeah.
a prison. So he knew that even before coming to the United States, but he wanted to be able to debunk it, and he felt I better have a psychiatric degree. So he studies psychiatry, psychoanalysis, psychotherapist. He was a practicing psychotherapist, but only with willing clients, contractual clients, and he didn't prescribe drugs. He said, if you want drugs, go somewhere else. That's not what I do. I'll explore with you what problem you think you're having. You tell me what you want from me. I'm selling a service. You tell me what you want. You're my customer. He wrote a whole book on the ethics of psychotherapy. So that's what I found, what attracted me to these people. I started reading Sass in the 70s. And I met him in the 70s because I was working for a little paper. My first career was actually a newspaper reporter for a small paper outside of Philadelphia. And he was going to be speaking at, I don't know who put it on, but something at the City Hall in Philadelphia. So I got my editor to let me go and cover the speech. I don't even remember exactly what it was about at this stage, but I did an article about him and I met him. And so that was the first time I encountered him in the 1970s. It was a long time ago.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you were influenced by Ayn Rand. You mentioned specifically, I think, the Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged.
Heavily.
In Saz's book, which you actually wrote an article about Saz and Rand, he levels some criticisms at Ayn Rand. Now, there's really two only that I'm concerned. Well, actually, there's only really one, but two broadly. Because I'm like you, I've never really been interested in the personal affairs of the people I study. I don't care if Ayn Rand was a raging psychopath in her private life. It doesn't really mean, I'm not saying she was. I'm just saying it wouldn't matter to me. I care about what she wrote about her ideas because that's what affects me. But Saz says, first of all, he relies, partly at least, on Murray Rothbard's account in the sociology of the Ayn Rand cult. The reason I find that interesting coming from Saz is because in the same book, Faith and Freedom, Saz talks about how Rothbard turned his thesis, Saz's thesis, on its head in criticizing it. He said that Rothbard fundamentally got him wrong. And if somebody wrote something about me and got it wrong, I wouldn't then cite that person's account, for instance, on Sheldon Richman. I would be very skeptical. Also, there's other things with Rothbard where I think on history, he's kind of off with his assessment of the Jacksonian Democrats as libertarians and some of the stuff in where his idea of insurance premiums counting as currency in arguing for the the increase in the money supply. So there's reasons, and I respect Rothbard as an economist tremendously.
And his criticism of Adam Smith has been also attacked. So he's unfair to Adam Smith.
Right.
So I'm aware of all that stuff.
Yeah. So
I knew Rothbard too, by the way. I knew.
And from what I understand, he was a very nice guy. You know what I mean? And like I said, I like his economics, but I wouldn't cite him as a source when it comes to factual stuff because of the errors that I know he's made. I would cite him as an economist because I can make the arguments based on his economics that they're sound. That's a reasoning process. So that's one thing. But the main thing where I found that Saz is just wrong in my view, and I'm curious to get your take on it. And if you disagree, I won't argue with you. I just want to know what you think. Is he says that Rand adds nothing to the literature on liberty, nothing new. And to me, she offers a philosophical moral defense of capitalism that is largely missing. Now, what I mean by that is, for instance, Bastiat makes a moral case for liberty based on rights, but he doesn't justify rights. He postulates them. He just says, you have these rights and this is what violates them. Rand actually gets into the ethical case for rights and the ethical case for limiting government. To me, even if you disagree with her arguments, that's still an addition to the liberty literature that is unique. And Saz discounted that, and he did so while admitting he's not a student of her writings.
Right. Right. So, okay, on your 2 points, Rothbard first, and this will seem like I'm ducking, but I think it's totally reasonable.
Okay.
That's a question. Why do you cite his
Sure.
Rothbard on the cult, on the sociology of the Ayn Rand cult, when you've criticized in your other chapter on, when you're on chapter on Rothbard, uh, you criticized him, or he's been criticized for things. That, of course, is not a question for me. That's a question for Thomas Sass.
Sure.
And unfortunately, you can't ask him because he died in 2012. I can't, and today, for some reason, I can't channel him. Some days I can, but today's not the day. So I can't answer. No, I agree. It's certainly a fair question. If you find credibility problems on a person, how do you cite them on something else? Now, he may have a perfectly good answer. I never asked him that.
Sure.
He and I never talked about the book. And like I was saying this to you before, I have some criticisms of that book. By the way, this book is called Faith and Freedom. It's where Sass talks about libertarianism and psychiatry, the incompatibility, and then goes through several people to talk about where they fell down on this. And some, it's not all negative. Lots of it's positive about the people. But libertarians in general have shown either an ignorance or a lack of interest in Sass's causes. But Sass's cause, and I think he's right about this, certainly how he saw it, was really vital. If you care about liberty, it's very vital that you could get locked up in a mental institution, never having committed aggression against anybody. Maybe you bothered somebody. And, if it crosses into harassment and threats, then, as Tom would say, that's the time to call the police, or that's the time for the criminal justice system. So libertarians should be concerned about that. I mean, but they've shown a lack of interest for the most part. So that's the reason for that book. So on the second point about Rand, well, you're only echoing, and I think you already indicated this in your criticism of Tom. You're echoing what I said in the review essay.
Yeah.
And I say the same thing. That on the one hand, he says she made no significant contribution or advancement over, and then he names about 5, 6 people: Voltaire, Adam Smith. I forget who's in this list.
I think G.K. Chesterton was one of the people, maybe C.S. Lewis, but I'm
not
sure.
And I haven't read a lot of Chesterton, so I don't know why he happened to put him in there. I don't know all that stuff. But he says something like, "I'm not really familiar with Ayn Rand's writing," so I think I even say there, how do those two things get reconciled? So there are places where you can definitely ask those questions. I mean, I didn't get him on the phone and say, "How can you say this?" I think, what the heck, you're the guy. I wrote the review. That review, by the way, the review essay was in the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies, which is a very serious journal, edited by a guy I've known for a very long time, Chris Skibara, who's quite a scholar. And very good scholar. In fact, he wrote a very important biography of Rand, Russian Radical, which is where he made advances and discoveries about her education and stuff. Lots of good stuff there.
And Saz actually went to him to ask to make sure that he hadn't missed anything about what Rand had said about Saz. He went to Chris Matthews.
Okay, and to my knowledge, Rand never and Brandon never said anything about. To my knowledge, maybe I missed something.
Well, what Saz says in there is that she said he's something to the effect of, he has interesting work. I just wonder about some of his premises. To which Saz says, well, certainly it can't be my fundamental premise, that mental illness is a myth or some such thing.
Yeah, and that was a premise. He makes it quite clear that that's not a conclusion. He says that's not a conclusion. That's a premise. And that's like Mises, human action premise.
Yeah.
You didn't go out and discover human action. That would be an action. You say, wait a second, I'm acting. I guess there's action. It's the same with him and Gilbert Ryle and those people who occupy that space between mysticism and materialism. Because we're neither, at least speaking for myself, I'm neither a mystic nor a spiritualist or a materialist. I believe we are physical beings who mind. Not that we have a mind. It's not a noun. Tom said it's not a noun. It's a verb.
Yeah.
It's something we do. We're minders. Mind your manners. We have it. We have hints of that in some famous expressions we use. Mind your manners. Mind your business. We mind.
I've never yet come across an argument that refutes his fundamental claim. The fundamental claim is that it's a category error to ascribe to a non-physical entity, the mind. I don't know if entity is the right word, but a non-physical
Yeah.
existent, that to ascribe disease to it. And it's interesting because after reading The Myth of Mental Illness and the Ethics of Psychoanalysis, I still wasn't convinced. Then I read a book that was edited by Jeffrey Shaler called Saz Under Fire, and it was a
Yeah.
series of 12 debates. And what I found interesting was the people that were making arguments against him did as much, if not more, to convince me in the accuracy of his premise, as you say. A very unique, phenomenal thinker, in my view, who is very underrepresented and underrated amongst people, like even on like my Twitter feed, unsurprisingly, is loaded with objectivists, libertarians, and conservatives, and so with Facebook also. And Saz is somebody who is very infrequently referenced. I was very glad when I saw that picture. I
Yeah.
said, "Wow, somebody's mentioning Thomas Saz," So,
Well, I've been a fan of his for a long time, and there are some outstanding libertarians, unfortunately not with us any longer, who championed him, early on. Reiko's one, but Andrea Rich, who mentioned Laissez-Faire Books, she acquired Laissez-Faire Books at one point and really made it something else. And she promoted his books like crazy. And Roy Childs, who was the editor of Laissez-Faire Books, their catalog for a very long time, reviewed all those books. Huge fan of Saz. So you did have important libertarians in the movement, really trying to get people to read him. But I think a lot of people felt, well, what do I know about psychiatry? I'll be worried more about public policy and economics, and that's what Tom says in that book, Freedom, Faith and Freedom. He talks about why it's easy for libertarians to neglect this area. He doesn't think they should, but he can understand. He can kind of understand why they do that. So yeah, that's why I called him the unappreciated libertarian. And that was the subtitle of the piece, my article, which is available on the Libertarian Institute if anybody wants to look it up.
It's a very good article, by the way.
Thanks.
Now, you were the editor of the Freeman for 15 years. You must have read so many great pieces on economics and the application of economics to current events and that sort of thing. But I'm curious as to who you think is the best economist of the 20th century.
Oh, wow.
And why.
Is this the Tyler Cowen game? Have you had Tyler Cowen on?
I have not. No.
We're looking for the GOAT, greatest of all time. I didn't even know what GOAT meant until I heard Tyler Cowen.
I've heard of
He's
Tyler
trying to come up
Cowen.
with the greatest economist of all time.
Just the 20th century.
Oh, I'm not qualified. First of all, I took one course in economics.
Really?
Which is one more than David Freeman took. So, and you had David Freeman recently. So I guess I'm ahead of him, except he's taught economics for a very long time, even though he has a PhD in physics. I don't have a PhD in physics. I don't have a PhD in anything. I have a bachelor's of science in communications, radio, TV, film. That'll put me in my place, right? That's me. So I can't answer that question. I'll tell you who I've learned a lot from and who I was eager to have writing. I didn't have everybody I loved writing for me, unfortunately. Didn't always. Here, I'll name a name. I don't know how well this name is known, but it should be. And I knew him, and I saw him a few different times. Peter Bauer, P.T. Bauer. Do you know that name?
Yes.
P.T. Bauer was a British economist, actually born in Hungary, knew Saz in Budapest when they were young.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing? Small world. And they remained friends. Lord Bauer, he became a lord, was, if you're going to divide economics into various subdisciplines and say development economics, which is really kind of, all those lines are fuzzy. But if you want to talk about development economics, there was nobody better than P.T. Bauer. He smashed the case for foreign aid. He smashed Galbraith, fantastic guy. And they're also a very nice guy. He came to the U.S. a few times when I lived in the D.C. area and got to work with him and edit him, but never got him into the Freeman, unfortunately. But there's so many people that are good. I mean, I'm not talking about the greatest of the 20th century now. I guess, again, I'm not qualified for that. I mean, it's easy to say, well, if I had to pick one name, put a gun to my head, I'll say Mises. But
that's who I would say as well.
It's close. Mises is fantastic. Hayek, I have, took some positions I have to disagree with. Although I think later in life, I think he expressed regret that he gave so much up to the welfare state, especially when he wrote the Road to Serfdom and some other things. But I think he was maybe being strategic there, that he didn't want to turn people off so they could easily dismiss him as, oh, he's a wooden laissez-faire guy, and therefore not hear his message that if you try to centrally plan everything, you can't help but have totalitarianism. It's like it's a tautology. I think it's a tautology. If you're planning everything, if the government's planning everything, then the government's dictating everything.
Yes, absolutely.
Tautology is an equal sign there, right?
Absolutely.
So I can name people like that. I think Kerzner is fantastic. I love Israel Kerzner's work. Another person I did get to publish in the Freeman. He was very close to Fee, so I got to meet him, and he would come every summer to lecture, and I'd be there. So I was on a first name basis with him. Well, I called him Dr. Kerzner. He called me Sheldon. Among the younger group, I thought Steve Horowitz was fantastic. Unfortunately, died prematurely. Very sad. Great. Not only a great economist, but a great person, great spirit. Another one of those people with full integrity. Pete Bedke. I love all these people. Let's string them. There's so many that I got to publish. So I'll say Mises for the best of the century.
Yeah.
Maybe best of all time.
That's who I would take. But it's interesting to me. There's a name. There's a name you didn't mention, and I'm going to ask you about him. When I read the book Vienna and Austria, Friends or Foes by Mark Skousen, and it was a comparison of the Austrian school with the Chicago school. There wasn't Vienna. It was Vienna. No. It wasn't Vienna and Austria. I'm sorry. It was Vienna and Chicago.
Yeah, Chicago.
Yeah. But so at the beginning of the book, Mark Skousen tells a story about how when he became the president of the Foundation for Economic Education.
For a few years.
And he says when he arrived there, somebody came up to him and said to him, listen, I'm happy you're here, but you've got to stop going so easy on Milton Friedman. And then somebody else came to him and said, listen, I'm glad you're here, but you got to stop being so hard on Milton Friedman.
Yeah.
And like I said, Free to Choose was my introduction to economics. It was a great book, but Friedman gets very mixed reviews in libertarian circles. He's, I think, unquestionably the most influential of the, libertarian economists. But what is your take? Has that influence been for better or worse?
No, it's generally for good. And look, I am not such an expert. My orientation is Austrian. It was the first economics. I started reading. I told you somebody gave me Hazlitt and said you got to read economics 1 lesson, and you go from there. And I read a lot of other Hazlitt. So that makes a whole lot of sense to me, in the same way that SAS does, right? How these are, quote, a priori, and I don't mean that in the Kantian sense. I mean it much more in the Aristotelian, in the Rothbardian sense, because he was more Aristotelian than his teacher, Mises, was on this. But I realize, I've seen debates that David Friedman has had with Murphy over the methodology of Austrian economics. I've seen the critique that Brian Kaplan, who's an old friend of mine, I love Brian Kaplan at George Mason, but he's got a famous paper about why I'm not an Austrian economist, and so he makes some criticism of it. I don't feel qualified to say you're right, you're wrong. The Austrian approach still makes a great deal of sense to me, but I have to be open-minded on that. But that's my working orientation. I read Free to Choose. I read Capitalism and Freedom. I love when I went to Washington to became a professional libertarian. The first organization I worked for doesn't exist anymore, so you may not know the name. The Council for a Competitive Economy. It was one of the, after Cato, I think it was the next organization that Charles Koch helped to set up. And this was in Washington when Cato was still in San Francisco. So this was like 1979, 80, and they invited me to be the director of research. And David Bowes was the executive director until they hired a president, and then Bowes stayed on for a while, but then went to Cato. So we loved Friedman, and that was right at the time that Free to Choose was debuting on PBS, because that book comes out of the show. And I don't know if people have gone on YouTube to watch it. Fantastic show about Hong Kong and free markets and the pencil. He used Leonard Reed's, I pencil, the story about how it takes a zillion people to make a pencil. They don't even know each other. There's no central coordination. Yet we have pencils, and they're very cheap, and you can find them all over the place. And they're given away as promotional items, and you have to pay for them usually. So learned a ton from Milton Friedman. I know there's serious differences on method with Milton Friedman and the Austrians, and about the role of the Fed. He thought the Fed wasn't inflationary enough when the stock market crashed, and that's why we had a depression. And then you have the Austrian view that says the Fed did all the wrong, also was wrong, but in the opposite direction. Like I said, I don't have formal training. I didn't go through graduate school and read all the stuff that the PhDs read. And outside, I was too busy working and raising a family to be reading that on my own. Some people read it on their own. I realized we mentioned George Smith. George Smith was quite a self-taught person. He didn't have a college degree, but he could read tons of stuff. I wasn't that type, so I can't mediate between the Milton Friedman and Murray Rothbard or Ludwig Mises. I love Milton Friedman though. Got to meet him once. Got a footnote in a book of his, Theory of the Status Quo. You'll find a note to an article I wrote about the military-industrial complex. So,
see, I think he's wonderful, and I have a lot of ideological differences with him. But I find, as somebody who identifies in economics as an Austrian and philosophically as an objectivist, that Austrians and objectivists both tend to be so hard on Milton Friedman. And like I said, I don't think he's perfect, but he communicated some very good ideas in a very simple way to people. And I think that, and I'm going to actually get to this question in a second, that when we look for such ideological purity in everybody we're going to talk to, we're just going to lose every single time. And like, I think about you and we went back and forth a little bit the other day on Twitter about Israel. But here's the thing. I think that Israel is morally justified. You don't. But as far as policy of America goes, I'm totally against foreign aid. And I think you are as well. So the policy we would both support. So it doesn't make much sense to me to get into a long, dragged out fight with you about Israel. It's just not, it's not productive. And I don't have to agree with everything you say, and you don't have to agree with everything I say to say, okay, we're both basically fighting for the same thing. But in libertarian circles and objectivist circles, there's these constant, it seems, schisms. Now, some issues are important. Look, I think the immigration issue, where there's a lot of modern libertarians are taking this closed border stance, where I think they're just dead wrong. And I really do. And I will argue with them. I think they're misapplying principles. I think that to call themselves libertarians while taking that position is antithetical to the movement. But most things, most issues, I don't think are that vastly different. You know what I mean? So why? I have my view. I'm curious as to what you think. Why are there so many of these schisms within the liberty movement? I mean, people fight constantly. I mean, Mises famously didn't talk to Fritz Mackleb for 3 years because he disagreed with him on the gold standard. And then, Mises walks out of the, what's it called? Mount Pelerin Society.
Yeah,
and tells him, hey, you're all a bunch of socialists.
Because they're arguing what's the best income tax. So what are we arguing about? What's the best income tax? Get rid of the income tax.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like, why is
okay? You ask an age-old question. This question, you're saying, why does this happen? You've seen Monty Python's Life of Brian.
I haven't, no, but maybe I should.
Well, then watch the movie. As soon as this interview's over, I urge you to find it online and watch it. There's a famous scene in there. You can find this scene on YouTube where it's set in Judea, right? The Romans are ruling Judea. And so there are people that want to overthrow the Roman Empire. They take it they're the Judeans, the maybe weren't called Jews yet, or maybe starting to be called Jews yet. But the point is, there's the what is it called? The Front for the Liberation of Judea, but then there's also the Judean National Liberation Front. And then there's a third one that has a very similar name. They hate each other. And at one point one of them says, and John Cleese or somebody says, just let's remember who the enemy is. And they all shout out, the National Liberation Front for Judea. And they said, no, the Roman Empire. So this is a very old thing. Now, I assume they didn't have the libertarian movement in mind, probably. I'm not sure we were important enough for Monty Python to think of this. I'm not sure what year this came out, the 60s, 70s, I forget. But the Marxists were like this. And of course, they were in England, these guys. So it was true of the Marxists. In a small movement, you're always it just seems like this is what people do. So you're asking why. So I'm giving you my best shot at an answer. I mean, I don't have any specific reason. In a small movement, there's a tendency to want to be a big fish in a small movement rather than a little fish in a big, ocean. So once you're in the movement, you're looking for ways to distinguish yourself from the others. And so you may draw a few people around you who agree with you on what you think is some big issue. And like you say, it may actually not be a very big issue at all, maybe some minor detail, right? But nevertheless, you're not making any progress in the outside world. So let's make some progress inside the movement. Let's become top dog by saying, those are heretics,
Somebody,
I think you need to ask a good sociologist about this, or a social psychologist.
I'll tell you my hypothesis, but I want to tell you a funny anecdote first. Is I asked this question once on Facebook, and somebody responded. They said, "Listen, we know that we're never going to get our philosophy implemented. It's never going to happen. So this is what we do for fun." We argue with each other.
Well, it's kind of fun. But, Brandon gave a good speech. I wrote about this a few years ago. Brandon gave a good speech at the, I think it was, I don't know where it was, Freedom Fest or one of those things. And we didn't talk about Brandon. There's a chapter on Brandon in the SAS book.
Yes.
And I spent time on that in my piece, too. He was much harsher on Brandon than Rand.
Yes, he was.
Just to correct the record, I was going to say this earlier and I forgot. He says some very nice things about Rand. In fact,
he does.
In fact, he not only says nice things about Rand, he says Rand gets some things right on the issues that Tom Sass was concerned about. Although she's wrong in some other places. She compared the mind to the stomach. She says the mind is a processing organ, so is the stomach. Well, that kind of thing is Tom's going to say she's wrong about that. But in other things, like in private letters with John Hospers, I know I'm not in your subject, with John Hospers, she's like chiding him for thinking that the state should get into people's heads and, to prevent that, to make sure they don't commit another crime. And she was horrified by that. So you read the article. So, you see what she says to Hospers. She's very rough on Hospers for saying that's the path of totalitarianism. If the government's going to start, you think of the horrible science fiction movies where they're trying to change or Clockwork Orange or something, where they're really trying to get inside your head to we'll make sure you never commit another crime. So he says, good for her. She saw that. So she's much more favorable to Rand than she is to Brandon. But Brandon gave this talk about kind of the very thing you're talking about, the schisms. Why are there schisms? And he says it began to arise at a time when there was mainstream attention being paid to the libertarian movement. The Ed Clark campaign for governor in 1978 did pretty well. That's why he then ran for president on the LP in 1980, but he was an LP candidate for governor in 1978. There was a New York Times magazine about the libertarian movement around this time, and he said, some people are getting nervous about this. In other words, they don't want to be accepted by the mainstream. They're not important anymore. What would it matter if you could walk down the street and say, I'm a libertarian, and everyone said, oh, it's for all libertarians. What are you saying that for? You'd lose something. You'd have to become something else. Now, he doesn't mean he wasn't saying all libertarians are like that, but it's a movement will attract an element like that. And I think that made a lot of sense.
Yeah. Mark Skousen said about,
I think a lot of what Brandon had to say on psychology makes sense. Tom didn't think so. Tom says in that piece that he thought his psychological views were, he has a whole bunch of bad words, stupid. I can't remember them exactly. I don't agree with him. I mean, I think there's some solid stuff in Brandon. So I would have disagreed.
I do
I did
too.
disagree with Tom, but I never discussed it with Tom.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think Brandon, who I met a little bit. I won't say I knew him well or he knew me well, but we chatted a few different times. So I met him through Roy Childs, and I think he got that right. There are people attracted to a movement, and again, it's not all people, but there's a movement. It seems you can see why that would be a magnet for some types of people, right? Who really didn't feel like they were going to really make it in the world, but I could maybe make it in this small movement. And the biggest threat is if that movement were to suddenly become a mainstream movement and not really a movement anymore.
Yeah.
And that might make some people nervous. That made sense to me. I have to say.
Mark
I did an
Skousen said
article
about
a few years ago at the
Rothbard.
Future Freedom Foundation.
You know, what did he say exactly? Skousen says about Murray Rothbard, and he might have been quoting somebody else. I don't remember, but he said if everybody in the world became a libertarian, Rothbard would become a Marxist. Like because he's just very contrarian, and that reminds me of. But I think that I think it goes to what you said about Saz and Rako and integrity. Libertarians, objectivists tend to be principled people. And principled people tend to really walk a tight line. And if you sway from those principles, I think it has a tendency to become an argument. So I think a big challenge is to learn to be principled, but that doesn't mean you have to fight with somebody over every single thing. If it's a serious issue, then by all means, but if not, I just think that it's a waste of time. And it's not to say I never get, I don't step into that stuff, because I certainly do. Before I even start processing it, I see something on Twitter and I got to respond. But that kind of brings me to my next question for you is the liberty movement today. What is your take on it? On the state of it, on where it's headed?
I think it's a movement, but in a very loose sense, because you don't have to pay dues or pass a test or anything like that. If you say, well, I'm a libertarian, I guess you're part of the libertarian movement. So there's going to be lots of pieces to it. Like you say, there's factions, there's organizations. But I'm an inclusive kind of guy. I mean, I know that people talk disparagingly at times about Cato, about reason, and I can make individual criticisms of individual papers or articles that any single organization might have put out. But, I don't disparage them. I mean, I heard one sort of Mises caucus type libertarian say, well, I said it online. It was Dave Smith, who called Cato pretend libertarians. I would never talk that way, unless it was something extremely blatant, like, I believe in liberty only on Saturdays and Sundays, but not the rest of the week. I'd call that person pretend libertarian. I mean, Cato is an institution. I worked for Cato for 5 years, full disclosure, although different administration. But Cato is an institution. It's set up in 1977. I mean, look what it's done. I mean, it's true. It wanted to be, as Ed Crane, the founder, one of the founders, put it, and the first president put it, it wanted to be part of the debate, and not just the internal libertarian debate, but the real debate. Well, that's admirable. So no, they didn't in every paper say we're for. Well, they weren't. He wasn't. I don't think he was an anarchist. He was not an anarchist, but he wasn't saying in every paper, by the way, we want to strip the state down to that only those core. Those core. No, they would, if they were talking about Social Security. Yeah, they talked about moving it in a liberty direction. Now, I know there are other libertarians that say, no, you should never do that. Never talk about transition programs. That's accepting, you're committing a sin. What's the sin? You're accepting coercion, the continuation of coercion. Yeah, but if you're moving things along, you might want to say what your ultimate goal is. Yeah, we want to totally privatize pensions. People want to, be able to save their money in their own way. They're going to have a better return because if you're freeing the market. So you want to talk about your goal, I agree, but there's nothing wrong with coming up with transition plans. First of all, people are going to want to know, how do you get there? I mean, non-libertarians, they may hear your objective and say, well, that's kind of interesting, but it does matter how are you going to get there. And and I know a libertarian, you may know who I'm thinking of, may say, "Oh, I'm not talking about that. I only talk about the destination. I'm not talking about the route." Well, then why should I listen to you if you don't want to talk about the route? The route might matter.
It
Maybe you want
does.
to kill a bunch of people as part of the route. Now, the person I'm thinking of doesn't do that, but it's a natural question to say, how do we get there? Because we're very much look. We've had the state for a very long time. Take your starting date, the New Deal, the Great Society, you know, the progressive era. You can pick your date. I would pick it way back. I mean, in 1800, some of the more libertarian types were complaining that government was too big. In 1800, okay, the Constitution went into effect in what, 1897? Sorry, 1789. Huh? Get my dates mixed up. A few years later, they're saying, see, the Constitution didn't hold the government back. Look how big it is. This is 1800. So pick your
And they
date.
were right. In my view, they were right.
Yeah, my too. I mean, the Anti-Federalists, I think, had the better case, personally. And I wrote a book about that. I have a book on the Constitution. It's one of my books. It's called America's Counter-Revolution. Give you a sense of what it's all about. But the point is, it's been around for a very long time. It's very entrenched. Most people think Social Security was must have been here in biblical times. God created it. It's just, haven't we always had that? What do you mean? We haven't, you mean the public schools? We don't always have the public schools. And I'm not ridiculing people. I mean, they're born into it. And, if they're not libertarians, we don't understand how non-libertarians see things. We can't damn them for, why didn't you think of this in the cradle? I did. Why didn't you? No, of course that didn't happen. So we need to teach them. We always talked about it being an educational revolution, right? Or an ideological revolution. Well, that's what it means, teaching them. You don't just say, I'm going to wipe all this away, and they're going to say, oh, that's a good idea. I'll go for that. I mean, you sound like a Jacobin for one thing. And if they know what a Jacobin is, if they know about the French Revolution, they may say, well, maybe I don't want that. You're going to have a guillotine too if I don't like it. So I think we need to explain them. There's nothing wrong with laying out transition programs. Say what your goal is too. I totally agree with that. But you want to get it discussed in public. You want to get it discussed at the Washington Post in the editorial board. And that's what this is a roundabout way of saying these groups have contributed something. So I don't like this sneering attitude that they're pretend libertarians. I don't recognize them. Reason has lots of good stuff. Do I agree with every article? Of course not.
I think Reason's been great.
I don't really agree.
I actually saw a post on Twitter that called them regime libertarians, and it kind of infuriated me because I'm looking at the people they're naming, and these are people who have been in the liberty movement for decades that have done a lot of work. Do I agree with them on everything? No. But to call them regime libertarians or establishment, and it's just, it's first of all,
Beltway libertarians.
Yeah, it's just, and it's insulting, and especially coming from some, hipster libertarian who's made his bones on the internet to criticize guys who are writing this stuff and living it, for so long. This is very insulting. And there seems to me that there's been this, for lack of a better term, Trumpification of part of the liberty movement. And what I mean is that it's uncivil in their manner of discourse. They resort to insults. They're they're very anti-abortion, anti-immigration. And it has a lot with these online influencers that call themselves libertarians. And you mentioned Dave Smith, and I've gotten into it with him a few times on the internet. He resorts to insults, and I've told him over and over, look, just debate. And I'm not calling him a coward because he won't debate me. I understand. Look, this guy's famous relatively, probably not as much as he thinks. Like, people say that to me. Oh, well, this guy's so famous. Really, he's not. I mean, if you go into your grocery store and mention Dave Smith, your average person doesn't know who he is. So let's dial that down a little bit. But if you don't want to debate, that's fine. I understand. But to resort to insults, like bringing up the fact that I'm a convicted felon, okay, fine. 27 years ago, I committed a horrible crime. Got it. That has nothing to do with my criticism of you right now, of what you're saying and doing in the moment, the ideas that you have. If you don't want to engage because you're too busy, too big, too famous, whatever, then don't. But to resort to petty insults, it's
anybody who's followed my writing or knows me personally knows I have never done anything like that. It's not my way. And, you haven't been aware of me that long. It's only been a couple of years and that I've been aware of you, saying, I think
No,
I
no, no, no.
once.
I've known about you for 2 decades.
Oh, well,
Sheldon.
because of reading my stuff. But I mean, seeing me
Yeah.
on
Oh, yeah,
Facebook,
different. Yeah.
I've never really uttered a negative word about people. It's not my way. I just don't do that. It's natural. It's not like I have to tell myself, well, be nice now. I'm sorry. I'm a
I
nice
do.
guy. Can I
I
pat
have to
myself on
tell
the back?
myself.
I don't, yeah, I don't, this is me. It's my genes. Okay. I guess I had nice parents.
Jim Valiant, by the
Anyway,
way, told me you're a very
you're
nice
right. I
guy.
don't like,
You know Jim Valiant.
well, thank you.
Yeah. Jim told
Well,
me
we've
Sheldon's a
corresponded.
great guy.
Well, we were supposed to talk on the phone once a couple of years ago. I forget exactly what the issue was. It wasn't a book about creating Christ, which I really like that book. Maybe it was about, I forgot what it was about. No, but anyway, his dog, he had an emergency with his dog, and so he had to cancel the call. We never hooked up, but we've chatted a couple of times in direct message through Facebook or someplace. I'd like him to see the Saz and Rand piece if he never saw it, because that goes back to 2004 or six. I'd like him to see that. But anyway, so I don't like the stuff that you don't like that you're referring to, where it gets mean, it gets petty, it gets insulting, personal. I have tried to rebut, and I would say refute, but I'll let the reader decide if I refute. I certainly rebut. There's a difference between those two words. People don't always realize that. That case, I'll call it the Mises case, because Rothbard accepted it from Hoppe, on how libertarianism does not commit you to free immigration. I mean, that's the case, right? They're trying to say, look, you can be a libertarian and not be for free immigration. That's what the Mises side is saying. That, I believe, is their motive, and I don't know if I don't think it's purely a PR motive. Maybe they sincerely believe it. I'm not going to judge a motive I can't see. I don't have access to what their motive is. I have written a couple of articles, I think, refute this, or at least rebut the particular case about private property, about public property, and why they use that as, well, so the government can act like the owner, and assuming owners don't want immigrants coming on, we can keep immigrants off. I mean, there's a lot of missing links in that chain, right? Plenty of missing links. It doesn't hold together. I tried to answer that. Nobody's paid any attention to it. And then I followed up with a couple of other things about that, I forget the other angles, but I think I've hit it from like 2 or 3 different angles. And I think their case is wrong. And I think the LP, the Libertarian Party, may well nominate a guy from that camp. That would be Michael Rectenwald, who I don't know. I've never had any contact with him, but he takes this position.
Yeah.
Let's call it the Hoppe position, okay? Because
he blocked me on Twitter for challenging him.
Well, and he once declared me and my friends like Roderick Long and others enemies of liberty. So I guess is that a badge of honor?
Did you ever see my debate with him? He came on the show. I debated him. He said that faith and reason are Rechtenwald.
Yes, I did. That's how I first learned about him. Yes.
Yeah, we debated. He said that faith and reason are compatible, and then we ended up having we debated about it on my show. And during the course of the show, the guy, he says he's a disciple of Rothbard. He didn't know that Rothbard was an Aristotelian and that he didn't adhere to the same exact methodology as Mises. He thought that Rothbard was 100% deductive in the way that Mises is, which Mises, of course, was a Kantian in that respect, but whereas Rothbard was a Aristotelian. Rechtenwald didn't know that. And then when I asked him which came first, self-government or individual rights, he had no real answer to it. And I'm just thinking, well, how are you calling yourself a Rothbardian?
Yeah, it's been a few months since I saw that, so I don't remember those details.
But I challenged him often on Twitter and respectful. I'm not like I might be annoying because people don't want to be challenged, but I found it ironic that the guy who wrote Springtime for Snowflakes blocked me for challenging him. But right. Dave Smith called the open border libertarians and says they're worse than communists. I really think that faction, the Mises Caucus, they blocked me too, and a few but I really find them to be I think detrimental. And because I I've studied these ideas of capitalism and freedom now for over 2 decades. It's something very important to me.
Well, they started up in like 1986. So they go back that far.
Yeah.
I was in the early years up until about 1991 very close to the Mises Institute. I lectured at their first two Mises universities. It was before they had a building in Auburn, and they used Stanford University, very nice setting. And Rothbard was there, and the usual people were there. And I lectured. So I was part of it. I wrote every month for their little publication. It was called The Free Market. I think that's been long discontinued, but they did some collections of articles from that publication, and you'll find me in those if they still have those books. I don't know whether they sell them, but I'm in there. I was just writing basic economic policy stuff. It wasn't like advanced graduate school stuff. But so I was on good terms with Lou Rockwell, who was the founder and the president for a very long time. And Rothbard, of course, was until his death in '95 was right there. And I was on always very good terms with Rothbard. I'd been to his place. He'd been to my house. We talked on the phone. So we were on very good terms. I mean, I didn't make it a point to say, why'd you say this on page 83? Isn't that a stretch? I mean, I didn't do, that's not the kind of thing I did. No, I generally agreed with him. I mean, his history was stuff I didn't know about. I hadn't studied, so I didn't have a way to judge it right or wrong, but I read it and tried to learn as much as I could from it. And I'm sure I absorbed it to some extent. I certainly had his general outlook. Does that mean I liked everything he wrote? Where I could judge it? No. So I take issue with the same things that people often take issue with.
I just want to say here, though, there's people at the Mises Institute that I read that I like. Mark Thornton's one of them. I think he's great. I've had some brief interactions with David Gordon, and he was very respectful.
Oh, he's an old friend.
Yeah.
David
So
Gordon's great.
I'm not trying to disparage them. The Mises Caucus, which I know they take their name from there. One of the things that irks me about them is they've taken the Mises name to advocate positions Mises would never have supported. And that irritates me. Maybe it shouldn't irritate me. Maybe it's a pet peeve, but
and I'm not involved in the Libertarian Party anymore. I quit the party in 1983. You may not know this, but between 1981 and 1983, 81 and 83, I was the national vice chairman.
Really? No, I didn't know that.
I had been chairman of the platform committee in 81. So at the convention, I decided to throw my hat in the ring for vice chairman, and I beat two other people who had been campaigning for months. Because I'd been on the stage the whole day because of the changes in the platform. So everybody saw me, and it was natural, I guess, to vote for me. And I had all the factions supporting me. I was the guy that always got along with all the factions. The Cato people, the Mises people, Rothbard, and then there was a third faction too. I'm the guy that got along with everybody. So, but I quit the party in '83 because I didn't like the turn it was taking. It was too insular. They just really wanted to talk to themselves, and so I said, this isn't for me anymore. And a lot of other people quit at the same time, and a lot of them were Cato type people. So it was considered the Crane walkout. But I wasn't working for Cato at that time. I didn't go to work for Cato. I worked for Cato too, I should say. But that was in the '90s. So this was still the early, this was the early '80s, '81 to '83. So I really have a history with the Libertarian Party. I haven't been involved since. So I kind of watch it. I've watched some of the debates among the contenders for the nomination on YouTube. And I'm really sort of appalled by all of them, really, in different ways. Of course, I don't believe one vote counts. So, I'm not going to be voting anyway. One vote doesn't count.
No, Brian Kaplan has demonstrated that.
You have a better chance of getting hit by a car on driving to the polls or walking to the polls than changing the outcome. I live in Arkansas. It's clearly going to go for the Republicans. So anyway, but in most elections, unless you live in a very tiny town where it gets closer to having some chance of breaking a tie, you're not going to do it. So I don't know why people agonize. Who am I going to vote for? Who am I going to vote for? I say, what are you agonizing about? It's like saying, should I make the moon go left or right today? Well, you don't have any choice. You have no power over it. Why are you agonizing about it?
That's a very, very good point. Well, Sheldon, before we wrap up, is there anything you think we should have talked about that we didn't get to?
Wow, that's a great closing question in the last moments, right? Now I'll bring up some really big thing. No, I don't really have any big thing in mind. No, I hope we get to talk again because this is a lot of
Oh,
fun.
I love to
I,
have you back on. I
I
think
could
you're
talk all
wonderful.
day. I'd be happy to talk about the immigration issue. Now, I know you and I agree, so maybe that's not interesting. And I don't like the debate. I don't like debates, stage type debate, live debates,
Yeah.
even this in Zoom, but on stage either. Although I like to watch the Soho Forum stuff because it's more performance art than really substantive, right? It's all about gotcha, oh, I have some fact and then the person, is maybe familiar. So what's he supposed to do? He's on stage. You can't say, well, I need to look that up and confirm it.
No.
You can't do that. So if you want to, people want to debate, write, I'll write something, you write something, we'll read each other's thing and see if we want to rebut. That's the way to do it. So, and that's what I've done in immigration. But if you think you and I could have an interesting conversation for the viewers about
Oh, I
immigration
absolutely do. I absolutely do.
and disabuse people of this hop of view, which I think is a very bad view because it won't stop at immigration. The state can do all kinds of things in the name of, well, we stand for the owners. We're standing in for the owners. And so
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
could
I
do
would
that.
love to
I
have
would love
you.
to do that because it's an important issue.
No, I
Because
agree. I
not only do I
agree.
think Kaplan is great on this, I mean, Kaplan's Open Borders, the graphic novel, although it's not a novel, it's true, is a great book. But another guy who's unsung, and I've written about him several times, he teaches in Singapore, Chandran Kukathis. I don't know if you know that name.
No, I
It's
don't.
an interesting name. He was born in Malaysia. I knew him too because he was at IHS for a year as a postdoc. I got to know him well. He once held Hayek's chair at LSE, but now he's teaching at what's called the Management University in Singapore, political economy, and he's written a book on immigration. And you can find interviews and lectures by him on YouTube, where he talks about how he takes kind of an additional angle to Brian, because Brian talks about how we're locking people in poverty for the rest of their lives with the restrictions. Chandran doesn't challenge that. Of course, he agrees with that, but his point is restrictions on outsiders have to also be restrictions on insiders. You can't help it.
No,
You've
you
got to
can't.
be restricting the liberty of Americans if you're restricting the liberty of would-be immigrants.
Harry
Because
Binswanger
they
made the
don't.
same case.
Not only that, you have to actually define. You have to define what a citizen even is,
Yeah.
and that's political power he does not want to cede to the state. That's a power he doesn't want to give to the state.
Yeah.
He's fantastic, and I've written about him. You can, if you look him up on Libertarian Institute, you'll find my article.
I'm going to do some research on your writings, and I definitely want to have you back on to discuss that.
Oh, I'd love it.
Certainly.
This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you. It's been fun for me too. So where can people find you?
Well, Libertarian Institute, I do have a blog that goes back to 2005. So next year, 20 years, called Free Association. It's a blog spot. It's what is it called? Sheldon Free Association.blogspot.com. That stuff also has. I also have a Substack, which is the same stuff really. But if you think it's easier to find me on Substack, look for that. But just about everything. I mean, I didn't do the atheism stuff on the Libertarian Institute because that's political. But so my political stuff is on the libertarianinstitute.org, and the other stuff on the two blogs that I just named. And I also have a blog called The Logical Atheist, so you can look that up. That's a blog spot too. It's logical-atheist.blogspot.com, where that's purely about religion, and I'm very irreverent about religion. I don't respect anybody's religion, so I don't mind offending anybody.
Good.
But I'm pleasant. I'm always pleasant about it.
Pleasantly offensive.
I hope I am. Yeah.
All right, Sheldon. Thank you so much. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.